Welcome back, everyone, to the PB&J podcast, and we have a special guest with us tonight. Though I guess he's not too special, but that sounds kind of mean. He's not. Yeah, he is not a guest being interviewed. He is actually co-hosting this episode. Jordan could not be with us tonight, but in his place, we have Pastor Jake Gregory, who is with us. Another J, so it's still the PB&J podcast. And for those who saw our last episodes, he was actually our guest here, but now he is co-hosting this episode. And because Jake is a pastor and I'm a pastor, and actually Jake and I were roommates in college, and we also pastored in the same church. I worked as an associate pastor under Jake, which I know sometimes can be pretty risky when you work with friends, but for us, it was great. I loved working with him. Have a lot of respect for him. And I won't, start, just going overboard with all that. I don't want to make him feel uncomfortable right out of the gate, but he is a phenomenal person, great pastor. And in that thread, we thought, you know what, why don't we talk about what it's like to be a pastor? In particular, the relationship that pastors have with their church members, because this is a topic that is actually pretty difficult for us as pastors to talk about, because it's sort of weird to navigate. How do you explain what it's like to be a pastor and your relationship with lay people? And this is something that's actually been on my heart and mind for a while now, something that I've been wanting to talk about personally, but again, it's sort of awkward. So I'm glad Jake is here to make it a little less awkward. So that is going to be what this episode is about, which is exploring. I should have thought of a title before this. I guess exploring the pastor layperson relationship, essentially what it's like to be a pastor.
It's a
When it
very
comes to,
technical title.
yes, very technical title. When it comes to relationships. With that being said, Jake, you had mentioned something before we started recording that I thought was a phenomenal summary of this entire topic, because some people, when they describe what a pastor is like, they might use terms like, oh, like he's a CEO, he's sort of a business leader, he's a manager, very sort of corporate like, sort of a white collar position. But that sounds very mechanical, but I really like how you put it, which sort of differentiates itself from the more corporate titles, if I could
Yeah.
use that term. So why don't you share what you had said?
Well, I've been processing a lot this week as a pastor, and just the continued effects of the pandemic and how it shakes out in the local church, and that the decisions that people who have been a part of our church for years have made in part as a result of that. So, um, one of the things we get told is it's not personal. In fact, I can remember having a pastor years ago who would say, uh, you can't get offended in ministry. If you get offended, you've made it about you and not God. Which I understand, what he meant by that.
Mhm.
But the truth is, um, it's always personal, and
Yeah.
and that is, in the context as I was initially thinking about that, it was the context of somebody saying, "We feel led to go a different direction. It's not personal." What they meant is, we're not doing this to hurt you because we're upset with you, which is
Mhm.
very consoling.
Yeah.
But what
Yeah.
folks don't understand, because they can't, right? Because it's not been their experience, is that
Yeah. It's a
uh,
very different perspective. Yeah.
right? That as a pastor, it's always personal because. Uh, and I was having this conversation with somebody else last night. I said, "This is my church. Right? You are my people. You are the folk," and that's not possessive and ownership, but it's to say, this is the church God has entrusted to my care. You are the people He has
Mhm.
said, you be their shepherd. You be the one who leads them and guides them, intercedes for them. You carry the weight of their faith with them. That's incredibly
Mhm.
personal. And so
Oh yeah.
when sheep reject the shepherd, whether they mean to or not, it's personal, and that's when it's hard. But it's also personal when it's good. right? The relationships you
Yeah.
develop, the love and the care. I mean, to get to sit with a grieving family in loss is personal. To celebrate with a family in birth is personal. To walk with a couple through difficult days of marriage is personal. It's always
Mhm.
personal.
Yeah. And when you mentioned that, it made me think of a story. I mean, we're gonna have probably a lot of stories tonight. This was many years ago after I'd taken a pastor position, and someone in my church was getting married. So, the day of the wedding came, and I wasn't asked to officiate because I was brand new, and I was not offended at all. Like I totally understood. But being a pastor, I don't, it's hard to explain what it's just different. So the day of the wedding came, and I was like really excited for the family, and I wanted to be there early, just in case they needed any help with anything, because that is an interesting role of being a pastor, is in those moments. You do play a very unique role, um, even if you're not like the one officiating things, like you're still.
The
But
host. I mean, you're kind of
yes,
hosting it.
yeah, yeah. Although this was at somebody else's church, so it was even a little different. But I remember I
Yeah.
I wanted to show up early, and and I was with someone at the time, and they just thought that was the craziest thing ever. They was like, "When was the wedding?" And I was like, "Oh, it's at such and such time." And they're like, "Well, why are we going there now?" I'm like, I looked at the person, and it was and I was like, I don't know how to explain it. It's just because I'm the pastor, like I'm their pastor. Like
Yeah.
I want to be there with them. I just want to, I want to celebrate with them. I want them to know that I love them, that I'm happy, that I'm excited for them. And when I showed up, like no one was offended and no one was upset that I was there early, and they just enjoyed that I was there. And you're right, it's very personal because you get to be invited into those very special, very intimate moments, like what you were saying, like in those happy moments, like a wedding or like the birth of a child, right? The people like it when the pastor's there in the room and they can be a part of that. Not everyone, but a lot of people do. And but also in like the sad moments, like if someone passes away or someone's struggling, like I remember one time there was a parent who reached out to me and said, I'm having a really difficult relationship with my son. Is it okay if we both come in and just talk with you about it? Like those moments are so, it's very few people get to experience those moments. Like even within a family, people
Yeah.
don't get to experience those moments. And so you're right, it is very personal. It's a very special thing. And sometimes it can be very frustrating because it is so personal. And sometimes you feel like you carry too much weight, but it's one of those things that as a pastor we just love so much, and it's such a unique thing. And oh, I love
Yeah.
it.
I can remember. So within the first month that we were here in St. Louis, a gentleman who was in his mid 90s, who'd been a part of the church for many, many years, passed away from a short illness.
Hmm.
And all of a sudden, I was thrown into what it is to be a pastor in those moments. Another couple in our church, their their grandson was experiencing some troubles in his personal life, and his family was falling apart. um, and this guy from our church called me and he said, "Would you be willing to sit down and talk with my grandson this afternoon? We don't know what to do." And that was like on my second week. That
Hmm.
was like week two, and yeah, I guess. Okay. So we sat down, and it was like all of a sudden, like this is what it is to be with the people of God, to be there, to be God in the flesh, and to them.
And that's something that is very unique. And I don't know if we were in the same class when a professor told this to us. And I remember it was a very obscure idea, but it's always stuck with me when he says, as a pastor, whenever you enter the room, it's like it's like Christ himself has crossed the threshold.
Hmm.
And that sounds very pretentious. Like very gloaty, like, oh well, I'm just like Jesus because I'm the pastor. But that's not what we mean. It is seriously something unique that happens, like going into a hospital room where people are suffering. And it's like people that we've experienced, going in there and they see that we're there. And it's like it's a very comforting thing to them. And
Yeah.
it's almost like an effect of like if Jesus walked in the room, it's like that's how they would respond, or something similar. Like they were just, very
Yeah.
peaceful, just like, oh, pastor, we're so glad that you're here. And you don't even have to do anything. I actually, at one point, I stopped bringing my Bible to hospital visits because the most powerful thing to do in those moments um, isn't, I mean, yes, praying is always a very good thing, but it's like you don't have to have a sermonette or a devotional prepared. They just want someone there.
Hmm. So when a couple weeks ago, when I was the guest, on the podcast, I shared about my son Darren being
Mm,
sick, and I remember that class. Again, I don't know that we weren't together, but I remember that statement. And then when Darren was in the hospital, we had other pastors. There was, two or three other pastors from our district who came to visit us during that time, and it was as if God had entered the room.
mm,
One of them had been my mentor. Well, a couple of them had been my mentor pastor, but one actually pastored my grandma's church and was somebody that I had known since I was in high school. And they came a couple of times to sit with us, and we were in Lansing, Michigan, where they pastored where they were at that time. And he came during Darren's surgery and sat with us. And I experienced, and I thought, man, I will never again underestimate the power of the pastor walking into the room, because in that moment I was on the receiving end, right? I was the one, and I can tell you the peace that came over me when they walked into the room, and it was
mm,
like, we're not alone in this, right? This is
mm,
was powerful. The night we took Darren to the ER, the other pastor and the neighboring community, the pastor of the Nazarene church in our neighboring community at that time, happened to be in the ER visiting somebody else. And I don't know if he saw my wife or how he found out we were there. But next thing I know, he's in the room. And
mm,
in those moments, I was sitting on the edge of that hospital bed, cradling this, I mean, at that point, maybe 6 pound baby, as they poked him 5 times trying to get an IV into him. And Brian just sat there at the foot of the bed. He didn't say anything. He didn't read scripture. He didn't even pray with us. We just weren't alone as we sat there in that fear. Incredibly powerful.
There's also sort of a funny thing about that too. Certainly being there as a pastor is a very comforting thing to some people, but I've been also pretty amused by the fact that sort of that incarnational being of a pastor, that it's like Jesus is there. Um the funny part about that is sometimes it leads to very interesting conversations because people will open up to you as if you like are Jesus. And they will
Yes.
share very personal things with you. And sometimes it's so funny to me. I mean, I never make fun of people for it. I never share personal details. Like it's, that is a privilege that I take very seriously. But sometimes visiting with
Yeah.
people and they'll just open up about things totally unprompted. And I don't know if you've been in these situations and you're just stuck there like, what am I supposed to do with this information? Like, why are you telling me
Yeah.
this? It's so bizarre. Like
Yep.
one time I went to visit someone in town and I just, he grew succulents. And I was like, oh, I like to get some succulents because I was, my wife at the time we were dating and she loves succulents. So I was like, oh, I'll stop over and get some. And I go over to his place and he just, sits down with me on the stoop and he's has a cup of coffee and a cigarette. And he's just opening up about his life and the things that he struggles with and like the different things that are going through his mind. And I'm just like, dude, I'm just here to pick up a couple of plants, but okay. It's like, and it's so unexpected, but I love that though. Like it's so unique when that happens, and I always appreciate that people are willing to do that. But it's like one of like you just don't like no one teaches that. It's just this weird thing that happens when because it's not just church people that respond differently when a pastor is around. Like it's non-church people that
Oh yeah.
respond differently. Like when people find out you're a pastor, like it's sort of comical to me. Like they'll sort of change like their posture. They'll be a lot more careful about the words that they use. If they say like, a swear word or something, they like profusely apologize, like, "Oh, I'm so sorry." It's like, dude, I don't,
Yeah.
whatever.
I really don't care.
Yeah,
Yeah. Oh
it's
yeah,
like
I get that
they're
a
gonna
lot.
go up in
S-
flames if they swear
So
around a pastor.
yeah, it's so funny to me. On sobriety court, right?
Hmm.
I go well before COVID. I would go to the courthouse, a couple times a month for these meetings, and the judge will say to people, be careful what you say. Pastor Gregory's in the room. Like you got, and it's lighthearted, but and
Yeah.
then when I started hanging around with these guys in our shelter and working with them, over time they kind of relaxed a little bit. But there was a
Mhm.
period of time where they're like, "Oh, I'm really sick. We got to watch our language. Pastor Jake's here." It's like, just, just be you. Like, just, I don't care.
Mhm.
And that's the thing. Uh, they're meeting inside right now, but they loved it when in the summertime, we asked them to meet in the pavilion because of it was just safer with COVID. Um, and they loved it because they could sit out there and smoke and they could cuss without being worried about the lightning striking them and do their recovery thing. Uh, that they apparently didn't feel comfortable doing in the Sunday school classroom.
Yeah. But it's sort of a double-edged sword, though, isn't it? With sort of I guess you could call it an expectation of being around a pastor, but there's also expectation of being a pastor with like around non-Christians. That personally I find frustrating. I don't know what your experience has been, but this is actually where I am envious of non-pastors, like lay people. Like, so I always try to be very encouraging to the people in the church and let them know, like, what you do is incredibly significant because you do things as a layperson. You are in places, you are around people that you have a presence with that as a pastor I could never have. Because that's the thing. Like when a pastor is around people, they expect you to act a certain way. Like they expect that, you are a godly person. And so they know if they ask you a question about the Bible or if they ask you a question about Jesus or they ask you a question about God, like it's like you're going to say something affirming, like you're going to talk positively about it. And so in some ways it actually, at least this has been my experience, my ability to evangelize unchurched people is a bit diminished because, well, yeah, they expect you to say those things. They expect you to live that way. And so it actually has, again, this is just my experience. Jake, maybe yours is different, but it almost has a diminished effect. And so that's why I always encourage lay people, like the example that you have by living out your faith, in many ways is more impactful than mine because again I'm a pastor and people
Yeah,
expect that from me. They don't expect it from others, and so it actually gives a
I
lot
don't
more weight
know.
to it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with you um, in affirming the ability of lay people in that. At least in my experience, I wouldn't say diminished, but it certainly is different.
Yeah, I
Um,
might have used a bad word there, so thank you.
no, I mean, I'm not saying that. I one of the things that I'm not sure if we're really supposed to take pride in things or not, but
Mhm.
one of the things that I've kind of gotten to that I kind of take pride in is folks who are like in our recovery group who have said to me, "Man, you are not like any pastor I've ever known. You're just one of the guys.
Mhm.
You're just one of us." Now, my one of us is different, right?
Mhm.
There's a differentness to it. That's an earned. That's an that's an earned perception.
Mhm.
Early in those relationships, when I'm first meeting them, they are very reserved. They are very on guard. They do have those expectations. But over time,
Mhm.
as they get to know me and know that, you know, I can shoot the breeze, we can talk about life, but we can also goof around and be funny. I mean, people have come in to do community service, and folks are like, this is not at all. That's become a point of, I don't know, pride doesn't feel like the right word, but And part
Hmm.
of that is
Yeah.
personal for me. My grandfathers, they went to church. They Most of their adult lives, they weren't uh, real followers of Jesus Christ. But one of the things that made a difference, particularly for my mom's dad, was a pastor, Dallas McFarland, who Dallas would come over and they'd just sit and have a cup of coffee and talk. When my grandpa
Hmm.
was ill a lot, when he was in the hospital, Dallas would come to visit him. And, in fact, one time, one of my grandpa's buddies was there who was not a particularly wholesome individual. And, you know, Dallas comes in, they visit for a little while. He's there 15, 20 minutes, I don't know, prays with them and leaves. And my grandpa's buddy's like, who was that guy? He's like, oh, he's the pastor he's the pastor. Was I had no clue he was a pastor until he wanted to pray with us. Because Dallas, but that wasn't meant to be derogatory. Like that was affirming. Dallas had this ability to just go
Hmm.
into a room and be one of the people in the room in a way that was
Hmm.
edifying, in a way that brought life, in a way that built trust. And that's what saved my grandpa. Dallas was the pastor that could get through to grandpa. Dallas did grandpa's funeral. Dallas is the reason I know my grandpa is in the cloud of witnesses today. And so when I went into ministry, I knew I wanted to be a Dallas. And he means a whole lot more than just that to me and my family, but for now we'll leave it at that. And so for me, when people have said to me, man, you're not like any pastor I've known, it's like, all right, like I'm living up to that legacy.
No, I appreciate you saying that. So in that case, I think I'll amend my statement and not say that the pastor's witness is diminished. Um, but I liked how you said the pastor's witness is just it's very different than a lay person,
It's
and
a
they both
long,
have their strengths.
well, yeah, and I think it's harder to earn that relationship, right? I do think we start, a layperson meeting somebody like that is just two people meeting, right?
Yeah.
A pastor, there's already all of those presuppositions you have to tear
Mm,
down to then
yeah.
rebuild. So it does require you to be a faithful, genuine, be consistent, be who you say you are, earn
Mm,
their trust. Yeah, I mean, I think it's maybe diminished in that sense,
yeah.
or at least
So
stunted.
that
Maybe stunted would be a word.
it's hard to sort of transition from one subject to another because these all sort of weave together. But something that you said made me think of this. Maybe this is more the business side of being a pastor, but one of the difficulties is managing expectations with people, like what's actually expected of me as a pastor. Because, when you go in for an interview as a pastor, I'm surprised if a church actually has written out expectations. Like, okay, well, we expect you to, work this amount of hours in the office, which whatever that means, and we expect you to do these things. Normally it's just, we just want you to be a preacher of the word and we want you to love people, which is that's not a bad expectation for a pastor. But I'm sure you experience this, is that as time goes on you realize there's a lot of unspoken expectations, and it can be stressful at times to sort of manage what those look like and deal with what that is, like what is expected of a pastor and
Yeah,
what's a reasonable expectation and what's not. Because one of the things that happens, I don't know if it happens frequently, but it's something that I've at least thought about frequently, was, people being let down because of something I didn't know was expected of me and them feeling disappointed or something. I don't know. Is that something that you tend to wrestle with, or at least just the unspoken expectations?
yes. What I have tended to wrestle with more is people being surprised when I actually do what I say I'm gonna do. Which, I mean, to me, that's two sides of the same coin, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Because it's like they expect you to not follow through with things, which is an unspoken
Expectation.
expectation.
And I think it's because in the church, okay, so I don't know how much you want to just talk about what it is to be a pastor and how much we want to dissect the church and philosophy of ministry and all that stuff. But for so long in the church, our model has been you you come for a few years and you move on, and
Mhm,
it's mostly a series of lateral moves with a few. Every once in a while, you might just get a little bit of a jump, right? That's kind of been how, at least in our tradition, that's been how things worked
mhm.
for a really long time.
Yeah.
And so church people were the constant, right? So
Mhm,
when pastors would come in and would talk about change, they really didn't get to always implement a whole lot of change. And if what change they did, somebody else would come in and do something different within a relatively short period of time. So church folks over time, I think, have become to learn that pastors won't always do what they say they're going to do, or
mhm,
when we make a plan, we don't expect it to always come to fruition. That's not how I work. I mean,
mhm,
our belief is we're here for the long haul. I mean, at this
mhm.
moment, I have every intention that my children are going to graduate from St. Louis High School, and my daughter is 6 months old. Like, I'm here. So when we have made plans or said we're going to do something and then we do it, people are like, "Well, I didn't know you were going to do it already." I mean, last year, as we were kind of at the nearing the culmination of the merger of churches, part of that was doing some remodeling in the building to now accommodate the change. So we put
Mhm.
together a plan. We walked our leaders through the church and said, we want to do this, 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 and this, Okay. Well, some of them thought they were okaying a plan that might take years to
Mhm.
realize. We went and got to work. And they were, "Oh, I know we were going to do this
Yeah.
already." Well, what do you mean you didn't know? I mean, we told you we were going to do it. Now, I'm sure there are those expectations people have of me that I'm unaware of that I'm not meeting. One of the things that I have learned or been reminded of recently is that our people are more inclined to talk about us than to us. And
Mhm,
it really is hard to get people to come to you with their concerns versus just
mhm.
talking to others about them.
Yeah, and you had mentioned something with that. So when I was a pastor at the church where I was for about 3 years, which, like you said, that's pretty average for a lot of pastors. Um, and that was not the plan. That was not my plan going in. Like I wasn't thinking, "Oh, I'll just be here for a few years and then I'll make a move somewhere else." Um, but that had been the experience of that church throughout most of its history. And so that's sort of that shaped a lot of how the people responded to new ideas and even how they responded to relationship with me. Some people uh, had expected that I just wasn't going to be there for very long, and so they didn't like they intentionally did not get close with me, and
Yeah.
that made ministry very difficult, and that was a very difficult hurdle to overcome. And in some cases, I just never did, and I just had to accept that. But you're right, that perspective is very different, and sometimes it's frustrating, and it's not anyone's fault. It's just I remember as a pastor being in the office and sometimes feeling very frustrated because there were things in the church's history that I just didn't know about. Because you're right, the church is the constant, the pastor's not.
Hmm.
So the church goes through all these transitions, and as the pastor, you are the transition that they now have to adjust to. And I was surprised, 2, 3 years into that position, I was still learning things that the church would regularly do that stopped when I became the pastor, and I just never knew about it. Um, and yeah, like setting, trying to cast a vision for the future, and several people just being like, Yeah, but that's probably not going to happen. And so it
Right.
gets very difficult to cultivate, that community. And so sometimes as a pastor, you just feel like all you're doing is planting seeds, um, and
It is hard
tilling the
to
soil without ever really being able to see much fruit. And that's not a complaint. That's just an interesting aspect
of what
of
it
that
is.
role. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I say that, right?
Hmm.
Realizing that since the mid 1960s, our church, my church, has had 5 pastors. I'm the fifth. One was there 23 years, and then there was two shorter term, a 4 year stint and a 2 year stint, and then 19 years. And I
Hmm.
followed somebody who was there 19 years. Um, the thing is, typically what happens, you have a long-term pastor like that, you have at least one, if not two, short-term pastors who
Hmm.
then kind of help break the molds, and
Yeah.
it can give way to another long-term. And I kind of threw that to the wind. It's like, I'm staying here, I ain't moving. I'm not going anywhere. um, but so our folks were a little used to that, a little used to having,
Hmm.
somebody around for a while.
So I heard this line, um, again when I was in college, and this sort of goes, I guess, a little bit back to the expectations thing. And this is one that I don't know about you. I always struggle with it. In fact, when I was a pastor, it actually gave me a lot of anxiety. But the quote I heard from one of my professors was, "When you leave the office, close the door." And of course, what he meant by that was, you have to be able to create space for, not work. Like, don't bring your work home. Like, do your work at the office, wherever your office is, even if it is just another room in your house, but make that your workspace. Don't bring it into the other parts of your life. The struggle with being a pastor is, I mean, you're a pastor 24/7. And
Yeah.
so, like, there's always that expectation. You always know at any moment someone can call you on the phone, and you have to be a pastor. And so you can't have this strict, like, well, I'm just going to be in the office from 9 to 5, and if you want to try to contact me after that, like, I'm not going to be available. So that was a bit of a struggle for me at first, and you really have to be disciplined as a pastor to really set those boundaries and say, I don't know, like, what I did is I had my church secretary take, the calls on my day off, which was Friday. And I just said, on Friday, I'm not even having my phone on. My phone is going to be off. If you need anything, contact this person. If it's really an emergency, then they will contact me. And a couple times throughout the day, I'll turn my phone on. And there was never an emergency on one of those days. But every once in a while, I would get a phone call from someone in the church, and I would just be like, "Hey, like, just so you know, like, this is my day off." And it was like, "Oh, well, this isn't about business or anything. I just wanted to chat and see how you were doing." And
Hmm.
that was the part of this that I struggled with, which is, and this could just be a personality thing for me, but for me, it's like, if I ever have to be a pastor, I'm working. Like, and that's not that I hated it. It's just, it's different. Like,
Yeah.
sometimes I just wanted to be Ben. I didn't want to be Pastor Ben. And no matter what the context was, if it was a barbecue or if it was a funeral service, whenever I was around people in the church, first and foremost, I was Pastor Ben. And because that's a central part of the
It's
relationship. And I know different pastors, they can navigate that a lot easier. Like, some pastors can be just casual friends, and it's not, and they don't feel like they have to wear that hat. And I envy that, because I can't do it. Whenever
yeah.
I'm around someone from the church, I have to be Pastor Ben. So sometimes I just need a break from that.
No, yeah. Boundaries, I mean, that's where boundaries become really, really important, and your ability to be self-differentiated.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, boundaries become a really important thing to be able to say, this is, I have to draw a line here.
Mhm.
That's where I maybe am a little sacrilegious, in that, because for one thing, I don't have that high of an opinion of what it is to be pastor. There are some people, and I don't mean high as in you compared to yours. I mean, there are some
Mhm.
pastors I know who say, I'm the spiritual leader. I am the, some traditions they call it the spiritual father, but their understanding of the pastoral parishioner relationship is very is not equitable. I mean, we are here, we have the authority of God, we have the responsibility that God has invested in us,
Hmm.
and you can't bridge that, and that's fine. I mean, that's what fits with those folks, how they think, and to some extent their traditions. But that's not me. I am who I am. Who you get right now in this podcast is who you get in a board meeting.
Hmm.
Um, I don't take myself seriously. Uh, I I care about people. So I have struggled less with that distinction because um, being people's pastor is only work like when it's really costing me something. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Like in a moment where it's pastor, I need to talk to you. Like I'm wrestling with this. Okay, I mean that's work, right? Because that's
Hmm.
costing me something. Like I really have to. But if it's just me being me, we're hanging out. Like to me, that's not work. But that's because I'm very social. I'm very people oriented,
Hmm.
um, and I'm and that's where kind of maybe sacrilegious comes in is you get what you get. I'm not going to
Hmm.
pretend uh, to be one person with you and someone else on my casual time. And not that this others are doing, but like, I mean, I can remember reading books about ministry, and it's like, well, I got this one book somebody gave me when we came up here when I first became a pastor. It's called Overseers of the Flock, I think was the name of the book. Anyway, it talked about, for one thing, it talked about finding a wife of suitable stock who could cook meals on Sundays after church. But it actually said, don't get together with people on Saturday nights because you need to be preparing your heart for what you're doing on Sunday morning. And on Sunday evening, you
Hmm.
shouldn't be gathering with people because you should be sufficiently tired that your tongue could slip and say something that you should, breach a confidence or something. And I'm just like,
Oh dear.
but I remember reading that going, I am not that important. Like, I'm just, it is,
Hmm.
you get what you get. Anyway, back to what I was saying. Like, I don't take myself that seriously. Like, being with people is just being who I am. I'm processing this out loud. So maybe it'll turn out to be goobly-gook. I don't know. To me, being a pastor means I am I'm the lead sheep. I am one of the broken leading the broken. What I mean by that is I don't think that what I do is all that special. I'm just being who I am. So if that means getting together on Saturday night, so be it. I don't think my role on Sunday mornings is so important. Like what we do is important. Don't get me wrong. Like I don't want to downplay gathering of service or what it is to proclaim the word of God. Like I don't think it's not important. It's just I think for so long we have kind of made the pastor like this otherworldly being, right?
Hmm.
That carries this heavy weight and all that. And I'm just not into that. I'm just I'm just a guy who gets to preach and live life with you. Like that
Yeah.
does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think that does speak a lot to personality also.
Oh yeah.
Because like me being me, I'm not going to be around people. Like I'm going to be chilling at home. Like I'm like really even going to be in the office. Like and that's
Yeah.
me being me. So so going sort of back to my original point, then I would say yeah, then I guess that's more of a personality thing where for me like I I struggle to be because I'm a very strong introvert and you know this. Like I struggle to be around people. Being around people for me is work. Like just being there can be work for me. And so that's why on my days off a lot of times I just even go outside. Like even just going to the post office was tough because I was going to encounter people on the way and I'm like I just can't do that today. I needed that day in order to get through the other 6 days of being with people, which it's not like I hate it. It's just very draining for me.
Right.
And but that speaks to something else too, which actually really frustrates me about being in ministry is sort of these, I don't know where they come from, but Jake, I'm sure you've heard them too. I mean, you even mentioned a book that said it, where it's like these weird, like apparently universal rules of what a pastor should be that a lot of people just assume is correct. Like, as a pastor, you are supposed to be this way. You are supposed to be around people. You are supposed to be like, you're supposed to love preaching and you're supposed to be good at it. You're supposed to be a good teacher. You're supposed to be a good oral communicator. You're supposed to be a good businessman and a good administrator and like all these things. I know for me, it created the expectation that if I'm not any of those things, then I'm a failure as a pastor. And I
Yeah.
don't know where that comes from, but it's just sort of there. Like it's just sort of present. Sometimes it comes out in meetings with other pastors where other pastors look at you and says, "Well, you shouldn't be that way. You should be more like this." Like that's what a pastor is supposed to be.
Yeah.
And you're like, "What?"
Okay. No, like I'm so glad you said that because I have so struggled with that. The way I pastor now is not at all the way I was trained to pastor.
Hmm.
The way I spend my time, the things that I do, the things that I prioritize, not what I was trained to do, and not the things that on the day I graduated were my convictions. Right? I mean, I was formed in college and in grad school by some incredible professors who were
Mm.
pastors first, who
Yeah.
instilled in me this incredible love and conviction for how to do pastoral care, how to shepherd and how to tenderly lead and how to do, I mean, all of those things that aren't bad or anything. Like that was, I mean, it was rich, it was good, and there it still is a foundation. Right? It still kind of undergirds what I do. But once we got here and started living life in St. Louis, and God began to stir something in me, and it was a period of a few years and a series of conversations and trainings when God began to stir something in me, and ministry kind of made this shift from being about the church for the church's sake to being about the church for the community's sake, right? And all of and my focus, I mean, things just kind of made this big paradigm shift to where now what it means for me to be a pastor is not what it meant 5 years ago.
Mm.
I don't spend all of my time preparing for sermons. You've seen that like that iceberg analogy, like the sermon prep, and it's like like the
Mm.
iceberg. Like,
Yeah.
I hate that thing. I'm like, yeah,
Like that looks like
that's
there's a lot more sermon prep in that picture than what I actually do.
yeah, yeah, right. I don't. It's not all pastoral.
For 1 hour of a sermon, you should have like what, 20 hours of study? Something like
Something
that?
like that. Yeah.
Like, oh
It's like
my
I got
goodness.
20 hours a week to put into
We're not
this.
doing a TED Talk every week. Give me a break.
I mean, I don't. I'm not interested enough to do a study for 20 hours a week. But it's not all about that. It's not all about creating church ministry. Like for me, or on pastoral care. I mean, I'm available for pastoral care. I'm engaged. I love our folks. I love being
Mm.
together with them. But for me, pastoring is sitting in the courthouse, right? And speaking into the redemption of people's lives. It's sitting around the table with other agencies, getting to be getting to represent an agency and a church. I mean, I for years I went just as a pastor and representative of a church, getting to be that faithful witness in those places. That's what looks like a pastor. Well, guess what? There's not a lot of people who pastor like that. And I have
Mhm.
carried some guilt over that for a long time. Like, I'm not doing this right. I'm
Mm.
betraying the call. I'm betraying the ones who have shaped me. Look at all these other, guys on our district who are doing this great, all this work, and ladies on our district, and I'm not doing it that way. And I have had to kind of come to peace with that's not what God has called me to do. That's not what pastoring looks like for me anymore.
Mhm.
And learn to
Yeah.
be okay with that. And that's been hard. I mean, I really have felt guilty about
Mm.
that.
No, I know what you mean. And it's also hard too when well, I guess I'd say it's easy to compare yourself. So like when I took over the pastorate position where I was, which was in Gagetown, Michigan, there there was things about the previous pastors that I really envied. Like people would talk about, and they wouldn't do it. Okay, they sort of did it to compare them to me, but not like in a negative way. Because the people there
Sure.
were excellent. I absolutely loved how encouraging they were. I never felt like anyone didn't appreciate me, which I know is incredibly rare in ministry. Um, but
Hmm.
but hearing them talk about the previous pastors and the way that they could preach a sermon, and like the altars would be lined with people, and there was just real heartfelt transformations that were taking place on Sunday morning, and I was like, I couldn't do that. Like I'm sorry, I can preach, but I'm not that kind of a preacher. Like my strength is more like in teaching. I'd like to
Yeah.
think I'm pretty good at administrating, and that was a compliment I got, was in how I did board meetings, which some pastors are good at, some pastors aren't. And so you have to learn what your strengths are, and that was something I had to do too, was coming to grips with the fact and just recognizing, like, okay, these are my weaknesses and they will always be my weaknesses, and I can't try to make myself something that I'm not. Like I can't try to force myself to be a better preacher. I mean, certain, like, yeah, you can certainly grow in different areas, but it's just, there are some things, it's like, that's not your thing. Like that's not going to be the
Right.
thing that. So there was a moment in my ministry there where someone came up to me and sort of like what you said, people talk about you, but they don't talk to you. So I heard a lot from secondhand, which was pretty fun sometimes.
Hmm.
Um, but someone said, "Oh, so and so was wondering, like, they were pretty concerned that we never do altar calls anymore in the church." And I thought about that, and my first thought, which I wanted to say, was, "Well, that's just because I'm not, I don't do them." Like, not that I'm against them. I just, in all the sermons I've done, it's just how I preach. It's very rarely an altar call thing. Like I just can't preach those type of sermons, which,
Well,
I mean, that's a certain, but
let's be
anyway,
honest.
so
There's fewer things.
sorry.
No,
Go ahead.
there's fewer things as a pastor more uncomfortable than doing an altar call and nobody comes forward. So, I
Yes.
mean,
So what I actually did in
let's just
response to
name that.
that, yeah. So in response to that, I said, okay, well, I hear it. And even the person that told me sort of told me apologetically, like they were sort of like, we understand, like, it's okay if you don't, but we just wanted you to know that that's what this person said, in case you want to know. I was like, okay. So I actually tried to do a couple altar calls like the next month, and it was like what you said, like no one showed up at the altar. So it was super awkward. And I was just like, okay, like it was really uncomfortable for me. I like had to totally rewrite my sermons those weeks in order to cultivate an altar call moment, and it was just awful. And so from that point on, I just accepted, like, you know what? That's not how I do it. Like that is just not my strength. That is not the type of
Yeah.
pastor God called me to be. And again, I'm not against it. Like there were times when I felt that was the appropriate thing to do in a service, and it was fine. But sometimes people
Sure.
would say that to me, and I would just listen to them, but in my mind, I'm like, okay, but that's not how I'm gonna do it. And you're right. That's a very liberating thing when you can actually accept that about yourself and realize, a lot of pastors are good at that, but I'm not, and that's okay because my strength
Hmm.
lies somewhere else, and you sort of play to those.
And part of it is finding ways to work around your strengths. Right. So going with the altar call analogy, right? There, there's other ways to utilize the altars than
Mhm.
a altar call response.
Yeah.
I can remember having that conversation with someone. Well, we never. I mean, we were losing altars. We never do altar call. So I did an altar call, and I was
Mhm.
like, so the person, I said, you didn't even come to the altar. Like, and it wasn't an altar call like come confess your sins or repent or be sanctified.
Mhm.
It was like we're gonna gather and have prayer. And it's like you didn't even come forward. Well, I can't kneel. So quit complaining about it. Like, we never use our altar. Like 6 people in our church can't even kneel at the altar. Everybody just lines in the front pews.
Yeah. But yeah, you're right. It's those even between pastors, those expectations. Like I remember being in so I don't know if you still have it, but in St. Louis, Michigan, on Monday mornings, the pastors would meet together and have breakfast together and sort of
Yeah.
talk about how the services went. And I remember there
Yeah, we
being a
still
few
do it.
times where there'd be, sometimes it came from different people, but there'd be like, one pastor or another who would start talking, and someone else would respond. And it was like, this person had a very specific view of what a pastor should be. And I know for myself, I never spoke up because I was like, yeah, he would not say I'm a good pastor because his view is very specific on what one should
Right.
be, and I don't fit that mold. And that's something
Yeah.
that is frustrating. But I also want to be encouraging because I know that there are some pastors that listen to this, and I want to say God called you with very unique gifts, and He called you to pastor because you can
Yep.
pastor in a way that no one else can. And don't feel discouraged because you don't
Yep.
measure up to somebody else or because you don't have the same gifts that somebody else does. And I get it. It's frustrating. I wish I could have the gifts that other pastors do. Like one of the things is vision casting. I just can't do it. I suck at it. I'm just really bad. That's a side note. The point is like embrace who you are because there is something special and
Yes.
unique about that. If God wanted that other person to be the pastor at your church, then God would have had that other person be the pastor at your church. But that's not who's there. You are.
No, that's that's very well said. Living your God created you with a particular set of strengths and gifts, and be liberated to use them. Be who you are. And I think that's one of the things that leads to burnout, high burnout rate with pastors.
Oh yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
is it's so hard to be self-differentiated in that way and to say this is who I am, and I don't have to compromise or change that just because you have expectations for who I am. And I'm
Hmm.
confident and comfortable enough in who I am and what God has called me to do. Now, that's not arrogance. That doesn't mean I don't need to grow and change and continue to. God has had things to continue to work out in my heart and in my life, but I'm willing to say this is who I am, and I don't have to fold to your expectations of me. And when pastors aren't capable of doing that, and it's not easy. I mean, it is
Hmm.
not easy. I think that's what leads to high burnout.
Yeah.
At least one of the reasons. One of the things.
Yeah. And that also breeds a lot of bitterness in pastors too. I think unintentionally, but it happens. And I'm thinking specifically of, so I interviewed at a church. And I thought the interview went fine. It was sort of a weird situation. Most of the church board members were new, like within a year, because of a really strange transition that happened. Um, and then I received a call later on because I asked, how did it go? Like, did they approve me? Like, did they want me to come and be the pastor? Is this going forward or not? And the person says, no, actually, the majority of the board, a slight majority voted yes, but some voted no. And the reason they voted no is because you're single and they didn't feel comfortable having a single pastor in the church. This was obviously back when I was single. And I was like really hurt by that. I was really frustrated. And I know I'm not the only one. And I know there's other
Yeah.
demographics that get rejected. I know there are some churches that just will not interview a woman to be a lead pastor. But there's all sorts of reasons for it. Some people say, no, you're too young. We don't want someone who's young. We don't want someone who, pick your reason. Churches have all sorts of reasons. And it's very easy to feel bitter about stuff like that. Because I know I did. And I was like, are you serious? Like, that is the dumbest reason to not have someone be a pastor is because they're single. But at the same time,
Yeah.
it's you could take the position of, you know what, I'm just going to make a big stink about this and I'm going to complain about it. Or you could take the posture of, you know what, that's clearly not the place God's calling me to be. Because I think that's something that as pastors, we need to
Well,
accept too, is that churches are not made of perfect people. Like every church is going to have its issues. And sometimes the issue is something that you're not going to be the one to do anything about it. And sometimes that reason is
right.
sexist. Sometimes it's ageist. Sometimes it's racist. But whatever it is, it's churches are not perfect
Symbolist.
people. Yeah.
Right.
So, and then I ended up, interviewing at Gagetown and they accepted me and they actually Yeah, but Gagetown actually preferred that I was a single pastor because they were like, "Hey, you have a lot more free time to be with us," which as an introvert kind of gave me a heart attack. But it was true. Like I had so much liberty to be with my people and to, transition to life there, and there was a lot of benefit to it. So it just, and
Yeah.
accepting that and just being like, you know what, this church rejected me for these reasons. I could be bitter about that, or I could just recognize, you know what, that's just a closed door, and that's okay.
Yep. We're talking about sharing stories.
Yeah.
So to talk about what it is to be pastor, this isn't my story. In fact, I talked a little bit about Dallas. So this is that had did my grandpa's funeral. So Dallas came to the church my grandparents attended when my parents were married. After a couple years in there, my parents got pregnant and had a baby who was full term but was stillborn. Dallas was the first one at the hospital. Dallas did the funeral for her. 18 months later, he got to do my dedication, which was, of course, very exciting. Then, he builds his relationships with my grandfathers, um, both of whom passed away, and he's the one who sees them through that, does their funerals. He walked with my family through not my mom and dad, but a broader family through a divorce. And we kind of saw him here and there. And then when I was in college, I got to preach at his church for a couple of years,
Hmm.
a couple of different preaching trips, and that was so cool to go back and stand on his platform and be there with him and with my family in the years. And all my family came because he was still kind of in the Lansing area, and came for that. I mean, it was this just incredible reunion because he had walked with us. And then when I was ordained, he did my prayer for my ordination. And I didn't tell anybody in my family that I had asked Dallas to do my ordination prayer. I just
Hmm.
I kept it a secret. When it came time, he prayed, and it was a surprise to all of them, and it was very emotional, right? And I just think, what it is to be a pastor. And that's not my story, but like that's the impact of a pastor on our lives, right? That really
Hmm.
changed the trajectory of a family in a moment where my parents' lives could have gone a very different direction with the loss of a child. Dallas's tender care held them, cultivated those relationships with my grandfathers, and ensured that their faith was in Christ. Celebrated that ordination with me. I mean, as pastors, that we are invited into those special moments and places in people's lives that really has the ability to shape people, to shape families, to shape history. And that's something that I don't ever want to lose a sense of awe and gratitude for in this work.
Hmm.
So anyway, as we're talking about what it is to pastor, I mean that's something. As we've been talking, I've just been, and I brought him up, and I've just kind of been that's been kind of germinating in my mind.
It's a unique thing. It's a unique calling,
Yeah,
a very unique vocation. Yeah. And I think it's for a good reason that the Catholic Church refers to their priest as father, because a lot of times it is like being a parent. And
yeah,
yeah, you do have the side of that, which is, sometimes it feels like you're just working with a bunch of kids. Because it's like, it can be like really frustrating how people react. And you're just like, I can't believe like I'm dealing with retirees and they're acting like this. And like, I have to be the adult in the room. And so there is that side of it. But I say that like with a lot of respect, because the beauty of being a pastor is it is like you're a parent in like the really special ways. Like you get to see people, overcome things in their lives, and you get to see them develop, and you get to know their story, and you get to know them like on a very personal level. And like so much so that I think oftentimes that relationship can be easily misunderstood. So I've been
Yeah.
called in the past sort of a people pleaser, and I know some pastors are referred to as people pleasers. A lot of times it's in reference to a situation where someone did something hurtful or they said something, and the pastor doesn't put in effect the right amount of discipline or response or whatever it is. Like I'm thinking of one instance in particular. There was someone in my church who had wrote a message to someone else. This was when they found out that I was leaving, that I was transitioning to a different role somewhere else. And this person said some things that, were not the nicest thing. Um, and, and I didn't say anything to them about it. I didn't confront them. I didn't say, hey, like you said something really mean, like you shouldn't have done that, blah, blah, blah. And this other person was like really offended that I didn't say anything. And they're like, well, you're just being a people pleaser. And I didn't know how to respond to that because in my mind, I'm like, I'm not being a people pleaser. I just know this person really well. And I know that that message isn't them. Like, that's not who that person really is. Like, they are really hurting
Yeah.
right now and they're really struggling. And I'm not going to get in their face about it. Like, they needed to just get something off their chest. And yeah, I disagree with how they did it, but I'm not going to slap them in the face for this. Like, and it's maybe I'm articulating this in a poor way, but the whole point I'm trying to say is you get to know people in a very, like you said, it's all personal. You get to know people on that level where, you get to know what's happening underneath the surface, and it causes you to respond to
Right.
things differently that I think sometimes can be misinterpreted.
Yes. I mean, that's part of, I think that's part of the burden. That's
Hmm.
part of what it is to carry the burden um, of being pastor. So, I want to be careful how I say this. Like, you do kind of get to see things from a different perspective. Sometimes you have to allow people to spit in your face because you know that's not really about you. And so rather than defending yourself, or, I mean, I've kind of been through something similar with that recently with a couple who has been a key couple in our church, a very special couple to my wife and I, and part of our lives has decided to go to a different church. I could get upset about that. I could have sat in our meeting and said, how dare you abandon us like this? Why would you I mean, and said all kinds of things that even I didn't necessarily really mean,
Hmm.
right? I could have, I could have gotten angry and out of hurt, burned
Hmm.
the bridge.
Which a lot of people on the outside could have seen as a justifiable response.
Absolutely. And some people would say you're being a people pleaser because you're not standing up for what you believe. No, it's, for one thing, it's not worth the relationship. But more importantly, I know them well enough to know what's going on,
Hmm.
to see what's, and to hear what's not being said and what's not being, uh, what's going on behind the scenes. And so if I have, so rather than being my own vindication, I'm just going to let it be. I'll take the lashing. I mean, and in this case, they're not upset with me. There's nothing I did. It's just kind of circumstances. But like, I can see all of that others don't get to see. Right? Others don't have the perspective to see into the situation that I have as their pastor, and I don't always have the liberty to give other individual, like third parties, that same perspective. So if it means I have to be the bad guy, or if I have to bear the brunt of that, or if I don't get to be vindicated, then that just has to be okay. It's it's a unique calling.
It is.
It's a unique vocation.
Yeah.
It is blessing and it is curse. It is life and it is death. Um,
Yeah.
it is joy and it is sorrow.
Yeah.
Uh, it is peace and it is turmoil. Um,
Yes.
I can remember in grad school one of the professors saying, "There are days where you will feel like this is killing you." I mean, and
Hmm.
he said, "There will literally be days when it feels is like when you can feel it in your bones. This job is cutting days off of my life." And
Amen.
some people will look at that and go, well, that's not healthy. That's not good boundaries. How can you let that happen? You can't. But my take has been yes. And that's what it is to be pastor. Because my hope is not in extending my life. I mean, I'm in no hurry to die. I got a lot to live for. But my hope is in resurrection anyway. Right?
Yeah. Mm.
So if this vocation kills me, this life wasn't my hope. Now, like I said, I'm in no way. I ain't looking to get out anytime soon. I kind of like my life. I like my wife. I like my kids. I like the work I do. So it's not masochistic in some way. I was telling somebody this the other day. I so struggle with the language of blessing. How I'm hashtag blessed. All right, God's blessed me. This is God's blessings. Because most of the time, the things we call blessings aren't equitable, and I don't know what to do with that.
Hmm.
But more than anything, it's because Jesus doesn't promise blessings, not the way we talk about them. Jesus promises us a cross, and so part of me says, of course, pastoring is going to kill me. I'm being crucified. I'm being crucified with Christ.
Yeah, I remember being told one time, and I articulated this one other time before, and the person I said it to really didn't know what I was trying to say, so he sort of criticized me for it, and I felt like a loser. But one of the things I heard was it was someone talking about their own calling to be a pastor. And again, it was one of our professors. And he said, I really feel like God called me for the sake of my salvation. And I think after these years, I understand what he meant. And I think I would agree with it.
Yep.
And that's not to say that it's an earned salvation. I'm not saying that, if I wasn't a pastor, then I would go to hell or something. But it's that being a pastor, like what you say, it's a very unique burden that I guess I'll say it like this. Since I haven't been a lead pastor, I feel like my spiritual life has not been as strong because I don't feel as driven to my knees as often as when I was a pastor. Like when you're a pastor, you are constantly reminded of how inadequate you are in and of yourself because you are always faced
Yes.
with situations that you're not prepared for. You're always faced with trying to make sense out of someone else's mess. And
Yep.
walking with people through that mess is that constant reminder that I cannot do this by myself. So I think I understand that
Yeah.
that's maybe what he said when he says God called me to be a pastor for the sake of my salvation. And that's not to say that pastors are better Christians. I am not trying to say that. I'm simply saying that's part of the unique part
No.
of it because ministry does destroy people though. Like
Yes, it
there are
does.
people who just totally lose everything, including their faith, because of ministry. Like it, yeah. I don't
No,
envy one who's a pastor.
I, I, I would say it's not because we're better Christians, but because, at
You
least
were
for
worse.
me, I'm worse. Right.
Yeah, I
I
mean,
mean,
okay, get a bunch of pastors together and just hear their conversations, and you will think, like, if
yes,
anyone needs a pastor, it's these guys.
yes. I mean, uh, yeah, it's saving me. I think God knew that if He didn't have me in ministry, He wouldn't have me at all.
Mm, yeah,
Um, and,
because it
and
forces you
and
to be disciplined. It
it
really
does.
does.
If I didn't have to be gracious, I wouldn't be gracious. If I
Mm,
didn't have to be compassionate, I wouldn't be compassionate. Right?
yeah.
If I didn't have to pursue holiness, I wouldn't pursue holiness.
Mm,
I know just how stubborn and selfish and strong-willed I am. I want to do what I want to do when I want to do it. Doggone it! And if it wasn't for the call on my life, I'd be following my own aspirations. I'd be doing what I wanted to do. I'd
mm,
be serving myself. I'd be my own God.
mm-hmm,
And so surrendering to the call, for me, surrendering to the call was sanctifying.
mm.
Surrendering to the call God had in my life is saving me. It is what's redeeming me. Yeah, no, that's my testimony. I mean, that statement. I
Yeah.
can so talk about those moments when you feel totally unprepared funerals was always one of the things that scared me most about going into ministry,
Oh,
because it's
amen.
those moments when it's like there's nothing you can say, you can't fix the situation, it's very uncomfortable, and I'm always afraid I'm going to do something to make it worse. I still, it's still, funerals still are one of those things that drive me to my knees.
Hmm.
Um, the first memorial service I ever did was a brief one for one of my best friends in high school for his grandpa, who I really didn't know. I was scared to death. I mean, I had no clue. I was still in college at the time. I didn't know what I was doing. I just went in there and shared some words of peace and um, tried to give them a little hope. He wasn't a believer, but I tried to give them a little hope, and that was it. And I can remember getting in my car, leaving that funeral home, as scared as I was. My prayer was, God, thank you for this call.
Hmm.
It was one of the first times in my life that I felt like I was doing exactly what I was created to do, and that has been ministry. Um, and those have been hard moments. I mean, that friend of mine, about 3 years later, I did his funeral. Uh, that was that was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do as pastor.
Hmm.
Talk about a moment where you don't want to have to be pastor; you just want to be, you know.
Yeah.
Um, I was scared to death, but I walked away from that funeral home that night at peace, because even though I was grieving the loss of my friend, I was doing exactly what God had created me to do.
Yeah, I think when we started ministry, you and I were both terrified of funerals. I've become a lot more comfortable with them. I actually prefer doing funerals myself. What terrifies me are weddings, like because everyone is expecting a wedding to be perfect, and I just couldn't do it. At a funeral, like there's already a dead person in the room, so you can't do much worse. So so there's not as much pressure, and everyone's a little out of it anyways. So if you make a mistake, like no, people don't really care. Um, but
And see,
but
I
I'm
love
just
weddings.
yeah. I feel like I would love weddings if I know the people that I'm marrying. And I guess this sort of goes again to something one of our professors sort of shared. He put it in a very interesting way. Correct me if I'm not saying it right. He said, don't prostitute your ministry, essentially, which is like, because some pastors are like officiants for hire, like, oh, someone wants to do a funeral, like, okay, I'll do it as long as you pay me. Someone wants to do a wedding, okay, I'll do it as long as you pay me. And there's no
Yeah,
real pastoral interaction happening.
actually, that's Thomas Oden says that in the book Pastoral Theology,
Oh, okay.
that we read in a class in college and talked about.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
and it
so
is.
that,
Don't he equates particularly funerals and weddings for hire with prostituting the sacraments.
thank you. That's a better way to say it. But you made the point, which was sort of what I was trying to make. I mean, essentially, I was
Well,
saying I feel like I could do weddings if I really knew the people and I like could love doing it. But I've had people come to me being like, hey, could you do our wedding? And I had no idea who they were. And I was just like, no.
I've done that, but I asked I would agree on the condition that they did premarital counseling with me.
Yeah.
And by the end of that 6 weeks, I felt like I knew them. I was, joyed to be there to get to do their wedding.
Mhm.
So,
But some people are just looking for someone. I think this couple, they were getting married like that next weekend.
oh
I don't
yeah,
know if they were eloping or something, but then if that's the case, they wouldn't want a pastor. They well, I guess it depends on if the pastor is able to confer the license. Anyways, doesn't matter. That's beside the point.
yeah.
Point is, I didn't have time with them, and I was just like, no, because it is an easy temptation, I think, for some pastors to be like, hey, I can make some money on the side here. And it's like, yeah, it's not really what the role of the pastor is supposed to be like. I mean, I feel like there's so much more we could say, but
Yeah, you could do a whole series.
yeah, I mean, we really could take a lot of time just talking about what it's like to be a pastor. But at the end of the day, yeah, there's a lot of frustrations with being a pastor, but I mean, geesh, I couldn't do anything else.
The only way I have been able to be co-vocational, I mean, which is what I am at this point, is because by the grace of God, we were able to create a ministry that was compatible with the church,
Mhm.
that became its own line of work, but as an expression of the ministry of the church, right?
Yeah.
And that's been a blessing to me.
That's going to do it for this episode of the PB&J podcast. If you liked it, leave a like, click like. If you have something you want to say, leave a comment down below or reach out to us and let us know what you'd like to hear us talk about on a future episode, because we'd love to hear your thoughts. We're always looking for different topics, different ideas to discuss. And with that being said, we will see you next time.